Well, the warlords took over, and some of those warlords were in his cabinet. Warlords, I mean Yeltsin and his party, Kravchuk and others. But then you've got people like Shevardnadze and Aliyev. And Shevardnadze once admitted in an interview that, yeah, we knew this, that what we were getting Gorbachev to do, we knew it would break the country apart. We wanted our own countries. So never mind what the people wanted, they wanted power. And even if I have to only rule over a small chunk, but it's my chunk, it's my personal fiefdom. And the LA of Azerbaijan is a monarchy.
Yeah,
Just like
but Stas, what you're saying is that they want to enrich themselves.
right, right,
That's what they wanted to do. Okay.
exactly, exactly. And that's what came to power. Groups that first and foremost were out there raping and pillaging the countryside. And look what came with Yeltsin. Groups are raping and pillaging Russia. The difference between Russia and Ukraine, first of all, Ukraine was already being set up as the anti-Russia on multiple fronts. Although a lot of Banderites went to the West. U.S. started preparing them and dropping them off into Western Ukraine from the 1950s to stir up trouble. Khrushchev released the Banderites. I mean, Khrushchev was Ukrainian himself. Khrushchev released the Banderites from the gulags of all the people that should have been shot. But I'm sorry, I digress. He released the Banderites, but the Banderites didn't go back to their villages and become revolutionaries or become, start partisaning again. Now, they got smart. They became excellent communists, infiltrated the system, and started breaking the system from the inside in Ukraine. But they weren't the only ones at that point because there's a lot of people that were looking at it. How can I get richer? I mean, look who the young Komsomolsky movement, right? They most of the oligarchs came out of them. At this point, and the West, by the way, was quite ready to step in and assist them, educate them how to steal properly in mass, because these people had never dealt with Western finance, all of a sudden become gurus in Western finance. No. But the West was there, and the West was ready to send people like Fowler and others, and just waves of these people that came in there, modern carpetbaggers. If you lived in the South, you know what that term means. So modern carpetbaggers that came in into Russia and not only Russia to help rape and pillage and break everything down. And the difference being is Russia as a civilization state sooner or later, there are always elements that rise up and take back the civilization.
I think one
Uh,
of the interesting characteristics on the dovetail of George's question is one of the most toxic and I think damaging elements of Gorbachev's so-called political reforms is it gave an opening to the cesspool called the intelligentsia because
oh
they
yeah,
were not interested in the well-being of the average Russian citizen in terms of putting things on the table, but they wanted to debate literature and historical figures and guilt and all of the, which is all nice and fine when you're all well fed and you're relaxed and you had a vacation and your kids are doing great. Yeah, let's talk about Dostoevsky, George, and we'll have a good time, okay? But see, that's how I see it. When I was living here in the late 1990s, I just saw these people. You're all fanatics. You don't care about your country. You're caring about your class that the Soviet Union created. Okay. That was one of the things I found really, and I saw it in Poland, but because Poland fell into the Western sphere, their influence would be much, much less. Russia was still besieged in many ways because it was still a target. And it took the early 2000s, everybody knows what I mean by that, to start putting them back in their box. If they want to go on radio and chit chat about things, I remember interviewing Zelensky in the early 2000s, and he said, well, the most important thing is, a new Chechen policy. And I said, well, what's that going to do for your voters in Moscow? And he had no answer for me. Hmm.
that's one of the curses of Russia. We've got our set of curses. One of the curses of Russia is that the intelligentsia for hundreds of years has been the fifth column betraying Russia at every single opportunity. This happened after Fyodor Yanukovych died when the time of trouble started. The intelligentsia were the ones inviting the Polish kings in. They're trying to grab power themselves and inviting the Polish kings in. We've had this problem for at least the last 400 or 500 years. The intelligentsia, well, they call themselves intelligentsia. I prefer to call them the liberal fifth column. Um, a lot of them aren't very intelligent, and they're not that educated as they think they are. They have, anybody that caters to them is making a very big mistake. And the whole Napoleonic Wars, I mean, was the same thing. If you look at the intelligentsia, then they were, Napoleon meets Alexander the First. They sign the Continental System, which blocks the British from trade on the continent to starve the British Empire. But the problem with Alexander the First, besides he's weak-willed, was that he was surrounded by Anglophiles, the intelligentsia, the liberals. And then Russia backs out of it, and then we get the Napoleonic Wars, invasions. Was Russia better off? Maybe, but what's the cost? And then the British influence comes back, and it happens over and over and over again. We see the same thing happening again with Nicholas the First. I'm sorry, Nicholas the Second. It's and it the man that the British and the West really feared was Alexander III, but unfortunately he died from a heart attack unexpectedly. There may have not have been a World War I if he was still alive and in power. But that's but that it's something that happens over and over and over. And the intelligentsia, in the end, by the way, they betray, including a lot of the nobility, they betray the emperor and collapse the empire. They take over as the Kerensky government. Well, it was Kerensky didn't come to power right off the bat. He was Minister of Defense, I think, at first. But the liberal revolution in February, and they cock it up so badly that the when the Bolsheviks revolution happens, they quite literally just walk in. There
Yeah.
is no charging and taking of the Winter Palace and the shooting of the Aurora and that it's all propaganda lies. They quite literally walked in and they started grabbing things away from the marauders that are trying to rob everything that he can grab
Well,
out of the Winter Palace.
Styles,
It was just
it's
empty.
the Duma that was meeting and the revolution was taking place, and there was a guard sent to guard the Duma, and or there was a number of guards, and the sergeant that was head of the guards suddenly, after like 8 hours of discussing, he said, "My boys are tired. We're going home. You're shut down,"
Yeah.
and that was it.
Yeah, and when Lenin finally got the courage to take over, because Lenin was not this brave man. I mean, Trotsky actually did a lot of the work. I'm not a Trotskyite in any kind. I'm a monarchist, if anything. But when they finally decided to take over, they quite literally sent messengers and started calling the different ministries and saying, "We're now in charge." And the ministers go, "Oh, thank God somebody's in charge finally." And because at that point, Kerensky, he did not run away in a woman's dress in the middle of the night in a car from the U.S. Embassy. He walked out in a sharp suit, sat down in the car for the U.S. Embassy, and drove away in the middle of the day. But I think Kerensky was playing toward the was playing a deep ball for the Bolsheviks. Either that, or he was the most idiotic man that ever lived. Because if you look what he did, first he disbanded the Grand Army, so no police. Second, he freed everyone in the prisons, not the politicals, everyone. So the murderers, the rapists, the thieves are running around. There's no police to stop them. The officer corps finally decides we got to do something. Kornilov is a fool who pulled the plug on the takeover at the last minute because he didn't want to spill Russian blood. Congratulations, 4 year civil war. How much blood did get spilled? He got killed in the process later on that civil war, but he could have had a chance to grab the government and maybe head off the Bolsheviks, but he didn't. So that's part of history. But so Kerensky frees the all the prisoners, disbands the police. The officer corps is in rebellion. He disbands the officer corps. He knows there's a revolution coming, and he gives out 40,000 rifles to the Red Guard. And then he leaves. And then he just leaves. Job done. And just to make it a little more interesting, Lenin and Kerensky are from the same home city. Lenin, who was an extremely rich man from an extremely rich family, all this, in the Soviet Union, nobody ever talked about that. That all started coming back out after the Soviet Union. Uh, Lenin's uh, Lenin's mother, Lenin's maternal grandfather was a baptized Jew who built railroads for the Tsar, became very rich off that. Lenin's maternal grandmother was a German aristocrat who was extremely rich. Lenin's father was half Russian, half Kalmuk. And Lenin's father, because he was the inspector general of the education system for the Ilyanovsk gubernia, the governorship, which is multiple provinces, he automatically earned the rank of nobility, plus pay and land. They owned four houses in Ulyanovsk. Every time they had some more children, they just bought another house. They're a very rich family. But the interesting point is, Kerensky, his father was a radical Marxist professor at the university they all went to, who taught Lenin. So these families are actually
Well, do you know what happened to Kerensky?
interconnected.
Do you know
Oh
what how
yeah,
where did he end up,
New
Kerensky?
York, New York
No,
City.
California. He was
Oh, there
at
was in California at
he
the
was
end.
at he ended and the ended up being well, who was it at Stanford? He was seen in his latter days as wandering the library. I
Oh,
mean,
because
he was taken
he was
care
one.
of like so many other people at Stanford. George, go
Yeah,
ahead, George.
yeah. So that that take it as it is, but that's the liberal elite for you in Russia. It's always been that way.
But it's interestingly that if you try to enter the minds of the leaders of the EU or the Michael McFalls and the people who are always pontificating about Russia, the Anne Applebaums and everything, ultimately they're all gambling on the fact that, on the possibility that there's going to be something like that again in Russia. That if you apply enough pressure on Russia, you just push and push and push, somehow there's going to be a 1917, a complete collapse. The whole place disintegrates. Maybe a useless figure like Kerensky takes over, or a Gorbachev or somebody like that. So that's just what their gamble is. That's why he goes, why are you doing this? Why do you keep pressing? Why are you going along with this? Well, maybe down the road we're going to have a complete collapse in Russia and some totally useless, ineffectual person is going to take over in whose hands the whole place breaks down, as it did with Kerensky and as it did with Gorbachev and then Yeltsin.
That true, but they need to study history a little better because it was a very close call, and only because of U.S. betrayal that Kolchak didn't take over. Kolchak's forces were very close to joining up with Denikin. Kolchak was just on the outskirts. I think it was less than 100 kilometers from Moscow. If Moscow had fallen, that was the end. It would have just been a steady rout of the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks were preparing to flee from Russia because as far as they were concerned, they lost. The problem with for Kolchak was he ran out of rounds, and the reason he ran out of rounds, artillery rounds and such, and ammunition, while the Bolsheviks held the factories, but the factories weren't working too well because they killed off or ran off the owners and the engineers, and figured that by they could just put in the average worker to run the factory, which you need certain skill sets. Um, the Kolchak had the gold, and he bought ammunition and weapons from the Americans, and the Americans, in their typical format, gave half to him and half to Lenin. And at that point, Kolchak's
Waited for
forces,
the winner.
yeah, right. They failed to link up with Denikin, partially because Denikin also got stuck in Tsaritsyn, which is then became Stalingrad and is now Volgograd. They were about 100, 150 kilometers apart from each other. They were about 100 kilometers east of Moscow. Again, if Moscow had fallen, that was it. Kolchak would have been the dictator in charge, and that would have been a very different issue. But even with the Bolsheviks, it didn't take very long until things started changing, and then eventually you got Stalin. So the West is betting on a fluke of nature. in Russian history. That there was somebody like Gorbachev. More likely, if you cause any kind of fall like that, you're going to get somebody closer to a Kolchak coming in or
Well,
Stalin
well,
coming in, and
Stas,
then
George's question, and I agree with him. We've talked about it endlessly that the West doesn't really have a strategy per se. It has more of a hope than anything else, which is
yes,
a pretty dodgy proposition to be making decisions. But there's all this talk about how to change Russia. But what's really interesting to me, and I think it's unclear at this point, is that how is it changing the European political establishment, the EU? How will this? You just said earlier that you see maybe something, some kind of breakthrough or pivot or change going on in mid-fall. Um, how are the Europeans going to absorb this? I mean, at this point in time, at least, in on the 21st of August, we see kind of benign neglect from the White House. They have other things to deal with right now. So what are the Europeans going to do?
well, my view from the White House, it was, if I remember correctly, it was Ford magazine. The first time I read something of the sort in 1998, talking about that the U.S. needs another good war. The good war. World War II was the good war. Not because there was some Hitler, that, by the way, American businesses helped put on, lift up and create Nazi Germany because, hey, money's money and we need to keep the war going, or start the war. I mean, Wall Street, I mean, American companies are neck deep in Nazi Germany, to the point that even, Nazi Germany couldn't start the war because the moment war started, there'd be a blockade. They wouldn't have any rubber. You cannot run a modern war machine without rubber. Belts, tires, pipes in the engines. In steps the U.S. and who was it? Was it the uh, no, the American chemical company with a French name.
DuPont.
Uh,
DuPont.
DuPont, thank you. DuPont steps in and gives Hitler the formula for artificial rubber that you make from oil. So, you got to keep the war running. Well, the the point on this was, oh, good Lord, I just lost my train of thought. This is horrible.
Yeah, but what my
But
point is that
I
we see this massive investment in every
yeah.
sense of the word. Political, diplomatic, ideological, and and my very first question to you after the internet problem,
Mhm.
they've invested so much. How do they reconcile their failure?
Okay, right. Yeah, I just remembered where my train of thought ripped off. I'm sorry. Um, so the first time I read an article like this was in Forbes, and that was the U.S. needs another Great War in Europe. Why? Because the U.S. When Europe is destroyed, the U.S. gets to write off its debts. It starts to become a creditor and has another Marshall Plan. Underlying in this is, and we provide the weapons. Uh, so if this is something that comes out in Forbes magazine 98, the elites have been talking about it for quite a few years before that. And from what I see is the U.S. is not going to fight against Russia. For God's sakes, no American president is going to survive having 3 million casualties come back dead. I mean, that'll be revolution long before that in the American streets. They're afraid to admit to the 1,000 plus dead fighting Iran, trying to write it off as 14. Yeah, you have to be an entire MAGA, an absolute MAGA fanatic to believe that even for a second. But the point is, and I've been told by several sources, it's around 1,000 dead, and mo many thousands of wounded, including very heavily wounded people. But the point is they're not going to suffer those consequences, and they don't need to. They're the arsenal of democracy that's now under a neutral flag. The Europeans, a lot of critics in Russia that, oh yeah, well, they don't have the gas, they don't have the steel to build up their war industry. They don't have to. The U.S. just as a short rundown. 2,500 M1 tanks in storage, 2,500 M1A1 tanks in storage. By the way, the M1s are now being upgraded to M1A1s, which is Chobane multi-layered armor, 120 millimeter main gun, over 6,000 Bradleys of various types in storage. Why would you keep old equipment like that? I'm not even talking about M60 tanks and probably some M48 somewhere in there too, patents. I mean, why would you keep equipment like that unless you're planning on making money off of it, let alone spend money upgrading it? I mean, these aren't like the Soviet tank farms outside of Kharkov where they just parked them and let them rot. There's still hundreds of tanks there parked out and just subtly dissolving back into iron ore. No, these are maintained equipment. It costs money to maintain them. It costs money to fix them. It costs money to upgrade them. The only reason they'd be doing this, and I'm not even going into artillery, anti-aircraft systems, old anti-aircraft systems, yes, but they're still there, like the Hawkeye. The only reason you're going to do that is if you're planning on making money off of it. And what
Well,
better way to
Stan,
make money off of
you're
it than
bringing
to
up
push the
money
Europeans
here.
to war?
Let me ask you a question here. Um, Currently, the U.S. Department of War, as it's called, has a budget of $1 trillion. Now they're in the process of increasing it 50% to $1.5 trillion a year. So,
Yep.
Stas, person that has been in the U.S. military, why can't the U.S. win wars?
Well, and by the way, it's a lot worse than that. I'll tell you why. Because first of all, you've got, for example, the Department of Veteran Affairs. In any other country, that would be part of the Ministry of Defense or War, what have you. And that's a half a trillion-dollar ministry, by the way, or a secretariat department. Plus, if you look at line by line across the U.S. budget, there was an NGO that actually did that about 10 years ago. It came out that almost a third of the U.S. Budget is military. It gets hidden. For example, the Department of Energy, they're responsible for all the nuclear weapons at the end of the day. Maybe not the rockets that lift the nuclear weapons, but the warheads, absolutely. It's basically a military department. NASA, half its budget is military satellite. It's all military. So the actual weight is huge. But here's the problem. So is the graft. The graft is insane. I mean, F-35, the plane that ate the Pentagon, is what's being now called. This is, you got to wonder how much they had to pay these generals. The maintenance contract that Lockheed Martin has on the F-35 is genius if you want revenue streams. There are subsections like avionics and propulsion that military mechanics are not allowed to touch. Only mechanics from Lockheed Martin, who you're going to pay $400 or $500 an hour, and they're there 24 hours a day for the whole team. And on the aircraft carrier, same thing. So they're making money, insane amounts of money off of this. But that's the problem. My my soldiers. This is the late 1990s. My enlisted soldiers, if they were single and they lived in the barracks and they ate in a chow hall, which was free, sure they had maybe like $700 a month in their pocket money to either save or spend, whatever. If they were married, they could no longer live in the barracks. They also had to pay for food. They were given an extra couple $100. If they were lucky and there was housing available in the ghetto on base for the enlisted soldiers, they got one of those apartments. If not, they had to get some of the economy. They were all running on food stamps.
But
Yeah.
They
just
were all
just
running on
to
food stamps to feed their families.
but just to
The
reiterate,
sergeants,
yeah, just to reiterate
uh,
Peter's question, that's a lot of money. That is a
that
lot
is.
of moolah. Why can't the United States win wars? You've spent a trillion, 1.5 trillion. Why can't you win a war with that?
Well, yeah, it's the way the money's spent. I said my sergeants, by
Well,
the way, after the last
I
roll
would
call, they
posit it. So I would say this to my question and to George's question. The point is not to win wars. That's not. It's immaterial.
right,
The proposition is how do we make money?
right. Yeah, and you look at the where the money goes. The money goes to the
Oh, and what
contractor.
is
The
the
money goes.
downside of losing?
There is none. There is none. Look, the American population has a memory hole of about 30 seconds. Who remembers Afghanistan? They only spent 19 years there, losing a war, and setting up a government that didn't last a single friggin' week. I mean, the Soviets set up a government that lasted another 2 years of nonstop war, and the only reason they fell because Gorbachev cut them off. Same thing, by the way, is what happened to the South Vietnamese. They fell to North Vietnamese army. The first one was destroyed by U.S. aviation. Second one, there was no U.S. aviation and no money for the South Vietnamese army. But it's similar cases. But the graft was insane. Nobody's held accountable. Who's held accountable for a collapse of
What
Afghanistan?
was it? I don't remember the numbers now, but it was some insane story for, like, for example, to get 1 gallon of gasoline to Afghanistan, they had to expend like 120 gallons of gas to get 1 gallon of gas to Afghanistan. I mean, and of course, it was somebody in Abu Dhabi that was making a huge amount of money through the transaction. Okay. I mean, that's just reinforcing my rhetorical answer to my question is that war is not, war has been financialized like everything else. It's a financialized process here. You extract as much profit from it. The consequences, well, let the politicians worry about that.
Exactly.
And since we've lost this war, we've got to fight it again. So let's spend more
Somewhere
money.
else. Well, I'll give you an example on that because the ash and trash, that's the support units, were not really ever deployed into Iraq because that would mean that not having deployed 150,000, you'd have to deploy around 600,000. They were brought in as contractors. Halliburton is an example. Halliburton uh, comes in through Kellogg Brown and Root. The army needs water. You're in a desert environment. The average person is going to be drinking about 3 liters of water, just drinking water, 3 liters of water. For 150,000 troops plus civilians, the Army's paying for all of it. What does Halliburton do? The same thing the Army could have done. They put up filtration trucks at the swamps around the Euphrates or the Tigris, and they start pumping dirty water into these filtration trucks and coming out with absolutely clean drinkable, absolute. They can take sewage water and make it absolutely clean, drinkable water. Cities do that, by the way, all the time. The British do that all the time. That's why they're becoming so feminine. But that's a different case. That's because they can't filter out estrogen out of the water, and they pump the water back in, so they don't have to take it from the Thames. And it's a problem up and down the UK. The level of estrogen in the men from drinking the water
I
is
think,
getting
George, I think we've
insane.
just heard
Well,
the
feminizes that.
defining reason for the decline and fall of the West. We just heard it.
Estrogen in the water. Anyway,
Well, the Roman Empire fell because the Western Roman Empire fell to sterility because they lined their wooden pipes for the aqueducts with lead. Well,
With
the
lead.
Eastern Roman Empire was willing to spend more, and they did it with bronze. So
Yep.
that's sometimes
That
cutting
is a
corners
true
isn't the best
story,
thing.
everyone. That is a true story. They've been
It is.
able to actually determine the lowering of IQ because of that
Yeah.
process.
It all
So,
goes back to, when the Greeks built a marble building, they built a marble building. When the Latins built a marble building, they built a brick building and lined it with marble. So they're always looking for the cheaper way. It doesn't always work well. Well, so
but the contractor did well.
oh, listen, do you know how much they were selling a gallon of water back, or I'm sorry, a liter of water, so 3.8 liters to a gallon, a liter of water back to the U.S. military for? $80. 80 for now you count up 150,000 people plus maybe another 100,000 civilians just for drinking water. It's hot, man. It's just a desert. At least 3 liters a day per person. You're looking at somewhere around almost about 1 million liters. Almost 1 million liters per day at $8 a liter. How many years? You're looking trillions of dollars just on water. Just on water. Yeah, why would you stop the Iraq War? I mean, this is great. We're making money hand over fist. And then there's fuel. You got to bring the diesel up from Kuwait, where you're buying it at like 15, 20 cents a liter, and you're selling it for about $100+ a liter, 250 kilometers up north to the U.S. military. I mean, the amount of money that was being made is just on support is just absolutely insane.
well, this is a really fascinating conversation. And thank you so much, Stanislav, for giving us so much of your time. Really enjoyable, really entertaining. So, Stanislav, look forward to having you on the gaggle again very soon. All the best.
Absolutely.
And
And I'll
remember,
see you in person soon.
yeah, exactly.
Yep.